Chapter 21. Mr. Edward, you bastard. The sky had completely darkened. Only one night light was on in the room, its dim yellow light making Ella feel anxious and uncomfortable. She had been locked up for 6 hours already, but she still didn't understand what she had done wrong. Logically speaking, after that kiss, shouldn't they have turned the page? What's happening now? The ringtone of her phone suddenly sounded sharply. Ella picked it up, and when she saw the word principal flashing on the screen, she frowned. She stared at the screen for a while before answering. Before she could say, hello, she heard the principal's anxious voice. Ella, you need to come to the orphanage right now, quickly. Her voice was almost crying, which made Ella stand up abruptly. Principal, what's wrong? It's Sophia. After the adoption failed today, she cried and locked herself in her room, not talking or eating all day, and just now, we found that she had run to the rooftop by herself. Is she giving up? Is she going to jump off the building? What? Ella's heart was gripped by these words. She widened her eyes. Principal, I'm coming right now. After hanging up the phone, she rushed to the door and started banging on it. Is anyone there? At the door, the driver immediately responded. Mississippi, I want to see my brother. I know I was wrong. No matter what, she had to see Mr. Edward first. She knew that others wouldn't dare to let her go. The driver hurriedly said, I'm going to call Mr. Edward now. Ella paced back and forth in the room, anxiously waiting, and 5 minutes later, the driver's voice came from outside. Mr. Edward is here. She immediately rushed to the door and looked out through the peephole. Brother, I know I was wrong. Please let me out. The man stood there, as if he knew where she was, his deep eyes staring at the peephole. Hearing this, he slowly said, You know. Yes, I know, I shouldn't have kissed you. I shouldn't have gone to your room. I really know I was wrong, please let me out. The man lowered his eyes. Just that. What else? Ella's mind was full of Sophia. She was so confused that she couldn't think of anything else. I was wrong. I'm all wrong, whatever you say. I promise. I'll listen to you from now on. Brother, I beg you. Let me out. I have a friend who's in trouble and I have to see her. Friend? Mr. Edward's eyelids twitched, and he chuckled in his heart. Was it Mr. Jean? Thinking of Ella's lies, he didn't believe her at all. His coming here was a mistake. If this woman knew she was wrong in 6 hours, it would be a miracle. Mr. Edward thought about this and turned to leave. Ella was anxious. Brother. Mr. Edward kept walking. It's really a matter of life and death, brother. Let me out. He kept walking. Mr. Edward. Ella was furious. You bastard. Let me out. Mr. Edward stopped and turned around. What did you say? Ella was frantic. Don't you know, what you're doing is illegal. Illegal? Mr. Edward sneered. That's better than letting you go out and ruin the family's reputation. Ella clenched her fists. I'm asking you for the last time, will you let me out or not? Chapter 22. Sophia, Ella is here. Her question had a sense of tragic determination. Mr. Edward was silent for a moment, but then he laughed at himself for thinking too much. This woman could be so righteous about being a mistress. How could she possibly have such a feeling? Then let me tell you. Mr. Edward spoke word by word. No. He thought that when his words fell, the woman in the room would continue to make a fuss, but unexpectedly, it quieted down. So she gave up? He was about to leave when he suddenly heard a noise outside. Oh my God! Ella! Be careful! Some exclamations came from the yard. Mr. Edward's eyes darkened, and he suddenly realized something. His voice deepened, and he ordered, Open the door! The driver hurriedly opened the door. Mr. Edward pushed it open and walked in, only to find that the room was completely empty. But the window was wide open, and the white curtains were gently fluttering in the night wind. He quickly walked a few steps to the side of the bed, and saw a woman on the first floor, limping and dragging her leg, running out. She had already run out of the front door. Mr. Edward frowned, said nothing, and turned to go downstairs. He drove after her. He felt an indescribable sense of suffocation in his heart. This woman, in order to see that Mr. Jean, was she willing to give up her life? The pain in her leg came in waves, but Ella didn't care. She ran out of the house, hailed a taxi, and headed straight for the orphanage. She was praying silently in her heart. Sophia must not have an accident. Otherwise, she would never forgive herself in this life. Her heart was so sour, and her eyes gradually blurred. She wished she could grow a pair of wings and fly over immediately. She urged, "Master, faster." The taxi driver smiled bitterly. "Miss, you've urged me 8 times already. I'm already at my fastest speed." Ella nodded, sitting restlessly. When the taxi finally arrived at the orphanage, she didn't think about it, jumped down directly, and ran towards the orphanage. The taxi driver was scared and chased after her. "Miss, you haven't paid yet." With this sentence, a thunderbolt exploded in the sky. Immediately afterwards, large raindrops fell down. Ella didn't have time to take shelter from the rain. She just ran inside. After passing through the front yard, she saw a small shadow sitting quietly on the roof of the 5-story building in front of her. There was a circle of children under the yard. On the rooftop, there were a few people standing not far from Sophia. The rain was too loud. Ella couldn't hear what they were saying, and the pain in her leg had already numbed. She gritted her teeth and ran quickly to the rooftop. The rain washed the rooftop, and the water flowed along the drainage pipe. Ella was completely soaked. She slowly, step by step, came to Sophia. When she got close, she saw that Sophia was sitting on the edge of the 5th floor, her legs swinging in midair. Her small and thin body seemed to be blown down by a gust of wind. Ella's heart was like being gripped. She said nervously, "Sophia, Ella is here." As soon as these words fell, the originally numb Sophia finally reacted, slowly turning her head. When she saw Ella, her dim eyes finally lit up. The rain was too heavy, but Ella still saw her mouth opening and closing, and heard her low and bewildered voice. "Ella, did I do something wrong, so they don't like me?" Ella's tears flowed down instantly. Chapter 23. He misunderstood her. The rain was pouring down. Not knowing whether it was tears or rain, her cheeks were wet. Ella looked at the girl in front of her. Her heart contracted, and a dull pain came over her. She slowly took a step forward. Then she squatted down, reached out her hand, and hugged Sophia tightly. Sophia let out a wow and started crying. She opened her mouth wide. The little girl was sobbing, making people feel sour. Ella held her tightly. "No," she slowly said, "Sophia, you have to remember, everyone is an angel with broken wings. Only when you love yourself can others love you." Sophia cried and nodded her head. Ella then hugged her and pulled her away from the edge of the roof. The group of people from the principal's office, seeing this situation, rushed up and took Sophia away. Mr. Edward had been driving, following closely behind Ella. His face was ashen, his hands gripping the steering wheel slightly, and his eyes were filled with rising anger. Even if it was the daughter of his adopted daughter, now that it was said, she was the lady of the Edward family. Being a mistress for a low-level small business owner, it was simply a disgrace to the Edward family. There is a saying that nature is hard to change. She was given a chance last time, this time. Mr. Edward's eyes slightly drooped. Don't blame him for being rude. Thinking about this, he looked up and saw the taxi in front of him, parked at the entrance of the orphanage. He was a little surprised, and then he realized that he had misunderstood her. He paused outside for a while. Thinking about something, he still drove the car over. He took out a spare umbrella from the car, held the umbrella in one hand, and walked in with the other. As soon as he entered the orphanage, he saw the small figure on the roof. He stood there watching the girl run to the roof. Not knowing what kind of mood he was in, he followed her up. And then he saw it all. The girl was crying and saved the child. Then a group of people crowded up. "Quick! Is the blanket ready? The child has been rained on. She must take a hot bath immediately to prevent a cold." "It's ready, it's downstairs." "Good. Go downstairs immediately. Take her to the hospital for a checkup. See if there is anything uncomfortable." They took the child away and then took her downstairs. But no one cared about Ella anymore. A flash of lightning crossed the sky, and the girl's face appeared clearly in front of him. She stood there, her wet hair sticking to her face, her small face as pale as paper. She looked at the direction where people were leaving. Her thin body was shaking in the heavy rain, giving people a feeling of being forgotten by the world. She, at this moment, compared to the usual quirky person, was like two people, fragile and heartbreaking. He looked at her steadily, standing still, not moving. After a long time, the girl finally came back to her senses. She lowered her head and walked back. As soon as she moved, Mr. Edward saw that the clothes on her thigh had all been dyed red with blood. His eyes narrowed slightly, just watching her. She turned around and walked 2 steps. Then her body swayed, and the whole person fell face down. Mr. Edward almost didn't think about it, took a step forward, and held her. The girl looked up in a daze, and after seeing him, she squeezed out a smile. "Brother!" And then her eyes closed, and she fainted in his arms. Mr. Edward looked at her steadily. His usually hard heart suddenly softened. Chapter 24. She's sick. Edward family. Mr. Edward sat on the sofa, his eyes fixed on the girl who was unconscious on the bed. Perhaps when she jumped down from the 2nd floor, she happened to hit something sharp, and her leg wound was grotesquely turned out. The family doctor cleaned her wound and said, "Mrs. Leg injury, the wound is a bit deep. If not treated well, it may leave a scar, but fortunately, it did not hurt the artery, otherwise it could be life-threatening." A sentence made Mr. Edward frown. "Will it scar?" The doctor hesitated. "I mean, it might if not treated well." "Then treat it well." Mr. Edward interrupted him directly. The doctor paused for a moment, and immediately understood his meaning. "Yes." He took a deep breath, then picked up the surgical tools and looked down at the wound seriously. Since the master values the young lady so much, he must not be negligent. But as soon as his hand touched Ella's wound, she shook violently as if she had been electrocuted. At the same time, a pair of hands were waving in midair, and she was shouting in her mouth, "Sophia, Sophia!" Mr. Edward was startled and instinctively walked to the bedside, and Ella's waving hand just touched his hand, immediately gripped it tightly, and the whole person instantly calmed down. Mr. Edward. Her hand was soft and boneless, but as soon as he thought that this was a lover's hand, he felt disgusted and forcibly wanted to pull his hand out. He exerted force, and Ella, who had just calmed down, immediately panicked. She held on tightly and did not let go. "Sophia, Sophia, don't leave me." Mr. Edward frowned. The doctor said, "Sir, don't move. She is struggling now. The muscles on her leg are all tense. It's not easy to suture. Please bear with me. Hold on for a few minutes." Mr. Edward. He was 100 unwilling in his heart, but thinking about the reason for her injury. Forget it. He stood there motionless, and Ella calmed down again. After the suturing was completed and she was given an anesthetic, Mr. Edward immediately let go of her hand, rushed into the bathroom, washed clean, and then came out. He stared at the family doctor. "You watch her." Then he walked out of the room. When he got to the door, for some reason, he flashed through her situation at the orphanage in his mind. He paused at the door, turned his head, and gave another order. "Report to me in time if there is any situation." "Yes." Mr. Edward went to the study, turned on the computer, and started working. After a long time, the door was suddenly knocked. He looked up and saw the family doctor walk in. "Sir, the young lady has started to have a fever. Presumably it should be an infection of the wound, plus the rain. I have already hung her up within 4. Mr. Edward moved his gaze away from the computer. "I know." The family doctor walked out. An hour later, the company's affairs were finally busy. He stood up, originally planning to go into his own bedroom to rest. But when he passed by Ella's guest room, he stopped. He pushed open the door of the room as if possessed, and walked in. The family doctor had already fallen asleep on the sofa. Mr. Edward didn't wake him up, walked to the bedside, and looked at the girl with the help of the dim light from the bedside lamp. She was restless in her sleep, and just then, the girl's phone suddenly rang. Mr. Edward looked down and saw a name flashing on the phone on the bedside table. Jean.